So Tom, I wonder if you could say a bit about the new data sources that are being available to governments and to national statistics offices.
Great, thank you. So, I guess we have starting point is we have a duty, a responsibility, if you like, to explain and understand the world in terms of economy, in terms of society, in terms of local areas. So, as national statistics officers, we should be using all sources of data in a responsible, ethical, secure way to really kind of produce information that supports decisions, that supports public understanding of what's happening, that supports government priorities, policies, and so on. And so the sorts of examples that I'd like to see are where we're thinking, more deeply and thinking really kind of out of the box around the types of data that's available to support policy making. Two examples right now. This morning, many of the media stories are around using wastewater testing for understanding COVID infection levels in advance of running tests on people. So you can use sewage plant information or analysis and actually test that water and find out, okay, these are locations where we're seeing upsurges, increases in infection levels for coronavirus, and we have not yet run programs of testing on people in some of those areas or some of those locations. That's a fantastic early warning system that we've developed out of new sources of data. Who would think that statisticians and others would really get to grips with sewage data? I'm struggling not to kind of use the sort of obvious analogies, but there's just some great stuff there about getting your hands dirty with real data at speed and supporting decisions, supporting our understanding of what's going on. Totally separate example, but related for me because it comes again out of the work of ONS and out of the data science campus, is around using what we call faster indicators to understand the economy. And these might be anything, so as well as surveying businesses, as well as looking at things like PAYE and VAT and turnover and so on, you might look, for example, at cars on roads or ships coming in and out of ports. So the sort of data sources we want to look at there are GPS data from shipping. That's an enormous record and resource of what's happening literally globally, and of this enormous kind of pattern of ships coming in and out and imports and exports. It correlates and produces really nice information that you can publish on a daily or weekly basis. So it's the sort of example that we've been looking at and publishing and producing a rapid indicator that gives us something on what's happening in the economy, almost in real time. Those are the sorts of sources of data that we must be looking at to support policy making, support decisions and so on from government and elsewhere.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Helani, what are the new sources of data that you're seeing being generated or collected now, and what can be done with them?
So, I come from a very different part of the world where there aren't a whole lot of data sets that are widely available. And as a think tank that works sort of outside of government and trying to influence policy, we really struggle to find. We don't have a whole lot of IoT and sensors on buses, certainly. But given that most of South Asia, for example, has over 90% mobile phone penetration, our go-to data source as one of the best indicators of mobility was the mobile phone signal. So getting the call detail records, which is the trace that people leave on mobile base stations, was one of our sources. Now we get sort of historical, meaning 3 months old, pseudonymized, meaning a unique identifier attached, and we can analyze that to identify, answer social science questions that have a mobility component. So for example, the dengue disease spreads when people move, certain types of vegetation and mosquitoes are involved. Those are the broad characteristics, right? So you can get the public data for certain things, but for people movement, we use the call detail records. National statistics offices do the census every 10 years. In between, the predictions are really quite off in terms of population, where they are, and migration. So we use it to understand and map migration. And the beauty of this is you can really sort of define migration in different ways, whether it's 3 months, 1 month, 15 months, what that kind of thing is. We also did a lot of understanding of where people live and work, again, using mobility data, Google night lights, and a whole lot of other things to understand commercial and residential areas in the city. again, this is important because the surveys that are done by the national governments are at best every 4 years, right? The income expenditure kind of surveys. These are close to real time. Now, if you use the VLR data from telecom operators, the visitor location registry, that's actually near time. We just didn't have the hardware capacity, so we got the CDRs, which is, you know, slightly less dense. So that's one of those things. But of course, there's a whole lot of other things. Given that private sector is a large provider of services, even of health, interestingly, in many of these poorer countries, you know, when you try to do something like understanding where the ventilators and the doctors and the beds are to understand how you allocate resources under COVID, it's not enough anymore to understand where the government beds are and the hospitals are. You're lucky if you actually have a database of that, but you really need to bring in the private sector data, right? Mm-hmm. So I think for us, it's just that it's no longer one source, it's multiple sources. Even if you're looking at a taxi company's data to understand travel time, it's not enough to look at the Uber. You need to look at the other 5 companies that are also providing the data, right? And the government buses. So there's a range of data, and the government's own data absolutely is one of the key things. And they're finally, you know, getting around to opening it up and, you know, making it available. So we work with a range of data.
That's really fascinating. And I wonder, so these new data sources, are they always just augmenting government data, or are there any instances where they're being used instead of government data, or where there's no government data available, which would be a very different proposition?
So I think you get all three, certainly in understanding how the city is changing from commercial to residential and back and forth. That is supplementing and giving a real-time quality. In the migration example, it's giving a real-time quality. You will get a perfect input into the model to train it once you do the census every 10 years. Of course, you keep recalibrating these models. But in some cases, you know, there is no, you know, the transport survey has been done 10 years ago, and there is no more plans for a transport survey. So that's the only source of data available. So really to understand, you know, in Sri Lanka, in the Western megapolis region sort of planning, to understand what's happening at the periphery of the cities, where multimodal transport hubs might need to be placed. This is really the only kind of data that was available at that time and therefore was used. So we see a mix. Tom?
I think that's a great point, that it's not an either or, that you have so many important sources. And so as government and national stats offices, we really need to make sure that we're kind of branching out and looking hard at the data from commercial sources, from crowdsourced, and there's some great examples just there. Something kind of relevant to that, and the census trade-off, if you like, the 10 years kind of really robust, rich, deep data source that we collect in the UK and elsewhere, but is not available in interim, so every year. So for example, we've just published research on coastal areas and looking at some of the social and economic trends in those areas, and the data on population has been augmented there by information from Facebook, which is made available through the Facebook data for public goods, which comes through universities, so academic researchers, but really adds to what we know from census and from other population estimates. So that idea that it's all three, I absolutely agree with. I think there's something really important for us to all think about, the commercial sources, the sources of crowdsourced data and others. And some of those are UK based, but really excitingly, many of them are global. And this kind of comes back to, you know, there are lots of parts of the world which perhaps, you know, do not have some of the data sources that we do in the UK, but have many others and many alternatives. And then there are also global data sets. I'm thinking the shipping GPS I mentioned, the satellite information for, you know, high resolution imagery. And there are lots of other great examples where actually you can start drawing on information sources that are global. So you can share methods with other parts of the world. You can learn from what they've been doing and also kind of expand and kind of increase your own skill set and your own experience. So I think there's some really great collaboration and collaborative aspects to this as well.
You've spoken a bit about the opportunities, and I think they're fantastic. But it seems to me that, you know, the idea of kind of opening up the kind of the domain of the scope of what we're using and considering commercial data, crowdsourced data, and global data. I mean, that must come with some risks, I presume, or some challenges, or issues.
I think you might ask what's the role for government in some of this, and certainly from the kind of statistical office side, part of it is about the landscape of robust and ethical data use, of being really clear what we're doing with the data, really clear on the public value and the public benefit. In our case, publishing openly by default, so making our statistics and so on available and kind of talking about the work that we're doing. So all of those things kind of help set the landscape. And you kind of talk about public trust, for example. At ONS, the UK Stats Office, obviously the public trust in our statistics is hugely important. It's something we look at every year. And so the most recent kind of assessments of those show that 85% of the public kind of trust what we're doing with statistics and understand what we're doing. So there's that kind of base layer of being clear and open around what's happening and what's being done, but then also talking about the governance and the legislative impact. So, for example, we have something called the Digital Economy Act in the UK, which helps us with this kind of gateway for how we can share data and reuse it for research and statistics purposes. And that then backs up with the Statistics Act, which again kind of gives a really clear underpinning for what the National Stats Office in the UK is doing, and what rights we have to data and what we can do with that data. So I think that's a really important part of what government and statistics agencies should be doing here, helping set the landscape and the kind of the way that we use data for public good and public benefit.
That's really interesting. So using governance mechanisms to ensure the outcomes are responsible, even though the data sources themselves might be non-traditional. Is that correct? That's really interesting.
Exactly. And also one other on that, data quality, also super important. So the provenance of where this has come from, the way that it's been processed, the way that it might, for example, only relate to one part of the community. We know that there's huge interest in algorithmic bias, there's huge interest in bias around data sets. So understanding the representativeness, the coverage of your source, all of these sorts of, I'm going to call them boring but important. How do we know that this data is of good quality and that our outputs are of good quality? That's the sort of thing that statisticians, data users have been doing for decades. There's a really good body of knowledge on that. We have to apply that in the same way to novel sources from commercial and other. So again, that kind of provenance and understanding is super important.
That's brilliant, thank you. Helani, in your experience, what have you seen as the risks or issues or challenges around using non-traditional data sources in national statistics? Or what are the barriers to uptake of this?
So I mean, we constantly run into this issue of being able to, or sometimes not being able to, convince statisticians, policymakers to actually take this source of data as meaningful, as valid, and representative and good enough, certainly in between the large censuses, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So, transport models are built a particular way. Using call detail records instead, that's an uphill battle. Most of the statistical organizations don't have the data analytics capacity, right? They understand surveys and census and so on and so forth. And I think rightfully they ask questions about data provenance, as Tom said, and that's a very good question to ask. So that's a challenge. I mean, we've worked with, I would say 5-6 years to bring some of the organizations we work with to the level where they are now a lot more open to using multiple methods. To begin with, for only triangulation, for not really decision making, but that's okay. That's the start, right? Mm-hmm. But given the work we do and the sometimes reliance on mobile phones, we really worry about what that signal is. Like, is a mobile phone a person? We know across Asia, multiple SIM cards is a very, very common phenomena, right? So we worry about whether that phone is actually a human being, because we are using that as a proxy for movement. So we think about that. And of course, the bias and representativity issues. But we also run into interesting challenges when working with governments, in the absence of capacity, so a team of data scientists from my organization can certainly work with government. But it's a very difficult procurement because essentially it's a single sourcing, but the NSO actually can't single source from us. We are outside of government. So that's a whole other challenge. And then we rely on, donors and other countries' taxpayer money that funds the research and the engagement. So it's sort of a complex system to keep going until some of the NSOs and governments are more open to using these types of data and have the capacity.
That's really interesting, and I have two follow-up questions, if I may. So are there any kinds of new data or new data sources that you've seen more or less resistance to? So is there more uncertainty about using, say, crowdsourced data than commercial data? And also, Tom spoke about how, in the UK, they're using data governance. The ONS is using data governance to bring about that quality assurance, both of the kind of, the data provenance, but also the ways in which it is being used. So I guess it's a similar thing for you. Are there any kind of new data sources that you have been able to see taken up with confidence, and how was that done?
I guess I'll start. I mean, I've seen, the agriculture departments and the statistics officers in various organizations quite open to use satellite data, high resolution satellite data, sometimes low resolution, to do a range of activities. So for example, in some South Asian countries, they're even willing to work with private sector, the Google flood modeling, right? And warning systems, where the rain gauge data and satellite, all of these things are, combined to create quite sophisticated models that can warn you maybe 48 hours before the current, physics-based models can. And the governments are working with them, opening up the data to Google, giving it to them, and they're quite open to looking at, crop mapping using satellite data and so on. The private sector data from telecom operators, I'd say, is a work in progress from, let's say, taxi companies and so on. So those are works in progress, some more open than others.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Tom, I want to pick up on some of what's just come up. So when your team are working with new data sources, have you found the existing skills or existing domain knowledge within the team adequate? Have you had to develop new models to explain what the data is helping kind of shed light on? Or have you been able to just incorporate the new data in existing analyses?
Really good question. I mean, I think you need all of those bits. You need the domain knowledge. And I'll kind of take an example, where, coming back to the previous question, what are the data sources that are perhaps harder to work with, or where there is more of a discussion around? Clearly, anything that relates to people. So, and Helani talked about mobile phone data. You might also include financial transactions, things like that in there. We all use those. So, and I'm really clear about what I want my data to be used for, and where I'm maybe a bit uncomfortable. So there's a really interesting and important line there. And so that discussion around, the value of data and the importance of data for supporting public services, is a really important one that we're continually having, and absolutely we should be always having that debate. But so, for example, take financial transactions. For the economic statistics part of ONS, which publishes around GDP, around inflation, a huge range of other sources. Obviously, with things like COVID, we've stepped up a number of very rapid response surveys and pieces of work to look at what's happening to the economy. That's super important. But we're also interested in other sources. So we've been working with Barclays and with Revolut, looking at ways of really understanding what's happening in the economy and in kind of payment and retail and so on really rapidly. So we've published about that data, and we've brought that, made that kind of open, and we share as much as is possible there. What we have is needed to bring together the domain expertise, the understanding from the economic side and from the teams already involved in that analysis, together with people. For example, you might talk about data engineers, you might talk about infrastructure teams, where actually this kind of volume of information that we're talking about is really significant. So we need to have that technical capability. So it's important that for someone like ONS, the UK Stats Office, we have a very strong data capability group, which looks at the data infrastructure, that looks at the data science skill set, the data engineering, technical architecture. So that kind of deeply important digital side needs to be brought together as well. And then you've got the methodology. So we talked about data quality and statistics and so on. again, really important that you have those sorts of groups and that kind of expertise brought in. So you kind of have those three pieces. And again, every project and every piece of work in ONS draws on those three layers of expertise. So really important to have all of that. It's not about just data scientists producing something saying, look at this, it's brilliant, we have a correlation. We need to get much more deep, we need to go much deeper than that.
So the capacity building is kind of across the board, right? Not just in one team, but across the whole ways of working. So Helani, in your experience, the interest in or the drive for using new data sources in policy making, do you see that coming more from the policymakers or more from the analysts who are excited about the potential? So is it policymakers maybe having questions that can't be answered by traditional methods? Or is it the data analysts, really excited about what can be done with this and trying to maybe persuade policymakers to take it up and engage with it?
So I think when we started 6-7 years ago, I think it was very much knocking from the outside, the people who are excited with the data and the kind of answers we might be able to give and wanting the policymakers' doors open. But I think the conversation has shifted over time, but then the shock of the COVID has really changed the conversation, right? What you see is really willingness and demand for new sources of data. And many governments, African and South Asian, bringing, let's say, telecom operators to the table and other data providers, public and private sector, willing to work together to solve the lack of data at the moment to understand what's going on in the ground, whether it is the spreading of diseases or the socioeconomic impact of shutdowns and so on. So it's kind of shocked people into action, and many governments are, I think, going into it with sort of really a willingness. Now, the danger of that is that this is just a one-time thing, and once, if we are ever post-COVID, all these agreements will fall apart. The other danger is that this continues, but now this data starts getting used for purposes unrelated to COVID and socioeconomic recovery and actually violates individual freedoms, which can very well happen, right? So both sides could happen. So I think, in the absence of that sort of privacy data governance infrastructure, which Tom also, referred to, and certainly the trust that has or has not been built. These could be bad things or these could be amazing things. So there's no getting away from the need to really develop the surrounding support systems and the ecosystems. You can't get away from that. Even if you're addressing this COVID symptom, in the long term, you just have to do the hard work around that.
I think that's a really important point. And you both touched upon how this has maybe been more catalyzed or accelerated in order to support government's responses, and not just government, cross-sector response to the COVID pandemic, which is an international crisis. So I think in the few minutes that we have left, I'd be interested to hear from both of you about what you think needs to be done to ensure that the gains or the benefits from this moment in time are retained in ways that are, constructive, productive, that maintain public trust, but build on the new ways of working that have been established now. So Tom, if I can ask you that first.
Excellent. Maybe two things. So the first is around collaboration, and where many groups across the world are trying to solve some of the same problems. So the examples, from earlier just illustrate the challenges in understanding what's going on in economies and society and so on. Many of the data sources and so on are the same. So there's a huge kind of benefit here in sharing experience and collaboration. And so something like the work that the UN Global Platform that we've been involved in as a pilot to look at the sources of data that we can make available and reuse in many different countries really quickly to support statistics agencies across the world. That's the sort of example that I'd love to see scaled up. So that came as a pilot which the ONS ran with the UN Statistics Division, UNSD, and has now been mainstream, sort of taken on by the UNSD, working together with Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, working together with the UN Global Working Group on Big Data and Official Statistics. So lots of groups, lots of agencies across the world looking to collaborate, share experience, share methods. So getting to sort of technical geeky things like having joint GitHubs and sort of making all of your methods available in open repositories, and also thinking about how we reuse the same data sources rapidly. So that's the kind of first thing. I think there's a huge piece around collaboration which we've just started scratching the surface on. I think there's so much more value there. You know, and I really welcome this sort of conversation. I think actually the more conversations you have, the more you see those links being made with what other people are doing in other areas and other sectors. The second one is around data. And one of the really sort of big learning points over the last few months has been the value and importance of data from different sources. And we've just talked about some of those examples. What I would really, really, push for us all to be think about and make happen is something around a data for public good program. So I mentioned the Facebook Data for Public Good have their own system, their own service. We've seen Google and Apple publish regular data out from their mobility work and from phones, Android systems and iOS